Hello and welcome to Echo Conversations. Today we have Pete Miller from NeedHim Ministries, and we're going to do a conversation about 10 things that volunteers need to know when they're doing online evangelism. So Pete, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Andre.
Super excited to have you. So we've got this list of 10 things that you found as you've been working with these volunteers that are important to kind of remind them as they're thinking about online evangelism. So let's hop in. What's number one?
Yeah, most of our volunteers come from having some experience in evangelism, but it's always face-to-face, not online. So it's very different when you can't see the person, hear their voice, understand where they're coming from. So the first thing we really try to emphasize is listening goes a long way. It's very easy to cut one another off when you're not looking at one another. So hearing the story, listening to what somebody's trying to say, earning the right to share is really important as sort of the first thing we want to emphasize in training.
Yeah, it makes sense. So that's a good point, though. They're not looking at each other. So no matter if it's email, text, chat, phone call, social media, all of that, it's really either type or at most voice that they're hearing.
Right.
So I don't know about you, but I've sent a text message to somebody I really like, and they really like me, but then we've still had conflict over that, and it's like, no, I didn't mean what that was. So I think that's really good. So how do you listen well over, like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think one of the things you want to do is really keep it simple. Not overemphasize things, sort of boil it down to why they're reaching out. As much as you may suffer from the fact that you can't understand maybe what their tone is, they're going to be a lot more honest because they've got that anonymity separating them from you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so that's number one. And what's number two?
Yeah, so we think it's important to emphasize concepts over words. People tend to get caught up in sharing a certain way or following a certain number of steps, when the reality of it is, if we can start with Jesus Christ loves you and what he did for you, we can often advance the conversation much more simply.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So if we kind of really focus in on what you're saying is, like, don't say just this one thing and then this next. Don't do it procedurally, but like, because I think everyone's anxious to have these just like prescriptive, well, you do this thing and then you do this thing and then you do this thing and then you're done. And you're saying, like, why is that so important?
Yeah, you don't have to follow a formula. Every person you're speaking to is different.
Right.
They're coming from a different perspective.
Right.
Sometimes just meeting them where they are is the most effective tool you can use.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so give me one quick example of a concept versus like what would be an example?
Yeah, I think obviously you can share the gospel a certain way, right? You can create a gospel narrative that is as simple as 140 characters, or you can create a narrative that covers the entire Bible.
Right.
Knowing where this person's coming from, what they may already know or have experience with, you want to adapt to fit what's needed in that particular case.
Yeah, I've seen some ministries where a volunteer gets, like, they have their paragraphs of things that they just love to use, and I will watch them kind of force that into something that's like, this feels weird and different, and it doesn't feel like it's part of the conversation. So I could see how I would be I could see how I would default into that. Like, this is pretty close to that. But then I think the way that sounds to the person on the other end is like, whoa, what just happened? We just changed tone. Everything just changed. Right. And that feels weird because it's not specific to me. So, yeah, that's great. All right, so what's the next tip?
So we think it's important to mirror the conversation style. We literally look at the size of communication going back and forth. So if you're getting a lot of 1 and 2 sentence answers, you don't want to send 3 and 4 paragraphs in response to every one.
Interesting.
So share it in small bites. Ask if they're tracking with you, if they understand it, if it makes sense. Do you have any questions? And really just sort of make it bite size if that's how they're communicating. If they're communicating in longer and broader back and forths, then we can do the same. But we try to mirror their style so that there isn't one side or the other dominating the conversation.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So I can see how that could be a challenge, though, if you think about I can see how certain people, when they have a conversation with you, they may be answering things like yes, no. I can see how I could see these just like super short things. What do you do in a situation like that?
If needed, you try to pull some information out. Sometimes that's all you're looking for is confirmation. Other times, can you tell me more? What did that mean? Just try to pull more information out of them so you can understand where they're really at.
These open-ended types of conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, what's another one?
Yeah, so I think it's easy to assume when you're talking to people online that they're Christian. In fact, we never ask, are you saved or are you Christian? Because especially in North America, most people will respond yes. So what we try to do, again, open-ended, is ask questions like, where does Jesus fit in your life? What is your relationship like with Jesus? At that point, it really doesn't matter what they say. They can say, I have no idea who he is, or I love him and he's my everything. It's a launching point into a deeper conversation.
Yeah, because if you just say, are you a Christian, the concern is that they'll just default to yes, and then that's kind of closed, right? And now we don't have the way to have like an actual conversation about it. It's just like, oh, okay, well, thanks for coming by. Right. Okay, that's great. What's another one?
Yeah, so we use the analogy of a tool chest, and we all have a certain number of stories and answers and anecdotes that we want to share, but we emphasize you don't need every one for every conversation. So obviously try to understand where someone's coming from, what's the what part of the gospel, what part of God's word do they really need to hear today? Obviously, everybody's at a different point in their spiritual journey, so figure out the right tool for that conversation and just use that one.
I love that because I think there's a tendency when something goes awesome, we've had this great conversation with somebody, and now the next person comes along, we want to like replicate that. And I think God doesn't let that work that way because then we'll believe that it's us that's doing it, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so making it where it's like, okay, well, that did not work the second time helps me understand I don't just have this like secret formula toolkit where I ask this question, tell this story, and then voila, this amazing thing happens. Instead, it's a journey that we're going on where we're trying to listen to God. And I think that's really wise to tell them to do that because at least that's my tendency. I try to think that really worked before. I'm going to try that again, and I've learned over the years that absolutely is not going to work. Right. Okay, what number are we on? How many have we done?
No idea. We've got a few more.
Okay, all right.
One thing we try to remind people of, even though it seems obvious, is don't judge or argue. We're often talking to people who've been running from God, running or hurt by the church. It's been a long time since they had a conversation with somebody about a religious matter.
Right.
And they may share a really ugly story, a really broken story, and they may even know deep down they're wrong. But they're not really coming to us to be judged or to be argued with. We're all broken.
Right.
We often encourage people, if you've had a similar experience, let someone know.
Yeah.
Satan's big lie is you're the only one. So if you can say, hey, me too, I know exactly how you feel. I've been through that. It lets the person who's coming say, wow, these people understand where I'm at. They're not condemning me. This conversation may be worth having and continuing.
I think what you just said about Satan's big lie is that I'm the only one. I think that's huge. And I think, so those that are watching, make sure and catch that because I think I like to say that exposing secrets is a currency of freedom. So the more that you can like expose the stuff that's hidden, the more you make that available, the more healing can happen, and the more like what's the acronym for fear? False evidence appearing real. So we like believe that as we have these hidden things, that if we keep them hidden, but if we ever told anybody, it would be terrible, and these terrible things would happen. But really, that's where healing starts to happen, and so that's a big deal. Little special nugget inside there. Yeah, keep going. So
another thing we want to encourage people with is don't measure success by the results.
Right.
Jesus called us to make disciples, to share. The Holy Spirit is ultimately the one who saves. There's nothing more discouraging for us when a volunteer starts to feel like they're not having an impact because they haven't seen somebody make a profession of faith. Yeah. When the reality of it is, most people need to hear the gospel message 7, 8, 9 times before they're going to make that decision.
Sure.
We don't know if we're first or third or fifth.
Right.
So just be faithful in sharing the good news and encouraging somebody, and know you're serving the Lord well by doing that.
That's really cool. And I think the other side of that is the salesman approach of like, oh, I closed, the car salesman, and out. Nobody likes the car salesman. And so if the other side of that is like, oh, I'm going to close, it's like, oh, that's actually really pulling people away. Let's just meet them where they are. Let's have the conversation and don't be so focused on that. I think on both sides it helps kind of bring balance.
Yeah, when you least expect it is when somebody's going to make that profession.
Sure, totally. Yeah.
So another thing we think is important, because it's very easy to get caught up in these stories. You start listening well, you start connecting with somebody, you hear, in some cases, what are really tragic stories. And you want to relate, and you want to converse, and you want to help where you can. But the one thing you may forget to do in the midst of all that is share the gospel. Well, obviously, as a ministry here, to do just that, we want to remind people, hey, there's a place somewhere in that conversation where you can turn it towards Jesus Christ and share the good news.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah. And I think that's a huge thing. I can imagine I'm very empathetic. I think I feel a lot of the feelings of people when they share with me. And that's totally great. So, all right. So we've done quite a few. Any others for us?
I think there's two more that are worth reminding people.
Yeah.
So we're not counselors. We're online evangelists, if you will. Our organization is made up of volunteers primarily. There are cases where people need special assistance, where they need professional help.
Right.
We supply a list of resources where they can get that, and we encourage our volunteers in those cases. Hey, if somebody's really got sort of a life-threatening kind of issue, or an issue that's beyond what we're here to offer, don't be afraid to refer them to that person, to encourage them, and to ask them, hey, when things look a little better, let's have this conversation another time.
Yeah, that's really smart. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think some ministries will even try to call their team counselors. Of course, here in the United States, we've learned there's legal connotations to saying that. In other countries, there aren't as much, but I think it's smart to, in general, not to call these volunteer-led people that anyway, because that's really not the goal of this. It's really what we're trying to do is connect that person to God, and let that be the source of healing, and not through the wisdom of this volunteer that's
Depending on where you're at in the world, you can really set up an expectation that is false for the person that's contacting you. And we don't want to create that false expectation where suddenly now, instead of being joyful about hearing the good news and the hope that lies ahead, they're disappointed that they didn't get some kind of professional help.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And then I think there's one more, and it may be the most important one, and that's pray. Whenever we try to do this in our own power, we typically fail at it. So we have a saying that says pray before, during, and after every conversation. I literally have a reminder on my screen that says, Holy Spirit, please give me the words. Just use my hands, in this case for typing, to share what you know this person needs to hear. So can't really emphasize it enough. And every time you get to a place where you wish you could redo a conversation, and it doesn't matter how many times you share the word, there's always those conversations you wish you could do over. You realize I probably didn't pray enough or the right way or at all in that particular conversation, and that's why it maybe didn't go as I hoped it would.
Well, those are some huge tips, and these are things that you've tried and true, and you yourself, you've kind of alluded to it, but you yourself are actually in there typing, having conversations. You're not just running a ministry, but you're actually in there having the conversations, which from our perspective is something we really admire, and super cool to see how your heart is there in those conversations. And I think it's helped create these tips and help you understand kind of really how to deal with that. So that's really awesome. So if you've been joining us today, I really hope you've enjoyed all of this, and we'll put in the description below all of these 10 tips to make it nice and easy for you to grab those and incorporate those in your training. Help your volunteers know these things, and you may have your own that we missed out of this, and we'd love to hear what those are as well, so feel free to leave a comment below. Thanks for your time today, and have an awesome day. Thanks for watching. Make sure and like and subscribe to our channel. Click that bell so that you'll be notified every time we have a new video coming out. And I wanted to make you aware that we have some incredibly awesome resources totally free for you, whether you are or are not an Echo customer. Just go to echoglobal.org/resources and you can look at all of them totally free. echoglobal.org/resources. Seriously, now is a great time to go. echoglobal.org/resources.